She was 31 years old and standing in a rail yard with everything she owned wrapped in a single flour sack, and the man who had raised her since she was 6 had just told her she was no longer welcome under his roof. Ezra Buell was not her blood father, only the uncle who had taken her in when fever swept through the county and left her an orphan. But for 25 years he had been the only family she knew, and on a gray October morning in 1887 he stood on the porch of the house she had scrubbed and mended and cooked in since childhood and told her that his new wife did not want another woman's shadow in her kitchen. She had $11 sewn into her hem, a tin cup, and a Bible with her mother's name written inside the cover. 3 days later, cold and desperate and laughed by the station master, she paid $4 for a rusted, abandoned railroad car sitting on a dead spur behind the depot in the town of Larkspur Hollow, Colorado, a car so old the paint had peeled a bare iron, so forgotten the local boys used it to store their traps. They called her a fool. They said she paid good money for a coffin on wheels. But beneath the torn velvet of one long-abandoned seat, sealed away where no thief or vagrant had ever thought to look, waited something that would not only change the shape of her own life, but would quietly, patiently, mend a wound the whole town had carried for 11 years without ever speaking its name aloud. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Buell. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, a place others have written off the way they wrote off her, tell us in the comments. We would love to know you are there. Naomi had been born in 1856 in a logging camp in the Wisconsin Northwoods, the daughter of a timber scaler named Josiah Reyes and a schoolteacher named Ruth who had followed him west against her own family's wishes because she loved the sound of wind moving through pine more than she loved the safety of Boston parlors. Naomi's earliest memories were not of dolls or ribbons, but of a mother's voice reading aloud by lamplight from whatever books could be found in a camp that had almost none, and of her father's hands, enormous and scarred, teaching her to notch a plank so true that it would hold a house together for 100 years. Josiah used to tell her that would remembered everything, every season it had grown through, every drought, every storm, and that a person who learned to listen to it could read a tree's whole life the way other folks read a letter. He taught her to run her palm along a beam and feel for rot before it showed, to recognize by smell alone where the timber had been cut too green, to understand that the strongest wood was rarely the prettiest, and that beauty and worth were two entirely different measurements. Ruth, for her part, taught her something quieter but no less important, that dignity was not a possession that could be taken from you by poverty, only surrendered by yourself, and that a woman's worth was never determined by the size of her house or the softness of her hands. When Naomi was 6, both fever and heavy debt from the timber company arrived in the same terrible season. Her father, weakened by the illness that had already killed 2 other scalers that winter, went out onto an icebound river to check a jam of logs and did not come home. 3 weeks later, her mother, worn thin by grief and the same fever, followed him. It was Ezra Buell, her mother's older brother, a widower with no children of his own and a modest freight-hauling business in Colorado, who answered the letter from the camp foreman and came all the ways by rail and wagon to collect his sister's orphaned daughter. He was not a warm man, not given to embraces or soft words, but he was steady, and in the years that followed he taught Naomi the freighting trade the way her father had taught her timber, how to read a wagon axle for weakness, how to calculate a load so it wouldn't shift on a mountain grade, how to keep books so precise that not a single dollar could go missing without her noticing. Under his roof in Larkspur Hollow, she grew from a frightened child into a capable, quietly formidable young woman who could shoe a horse, balance a ledger, and outwork most of the men who freighted goods up from the railhead into the mining camps of the high country. She never married, not for lack of suitors, but because she had watched too many women in that town trade their independence for a husband's temper, and she had promised herself, quietly, the way she promised herself most things, that she would rather be alone and free than accompanied and small. For a long while, that arrangement with her uncle held, imperfect but livable, built on decades of shared labor and shared grief for the sister and mother they both loved. Then, in the spring of 1887, Ezra Buell, 61 years old and lonely in a way Naomi had perhaps not fully understood, married a widow from Pueblo named Cora Vance, a woman 18 years his junior with sharp eyes and a sharper sense of what she was and was not willing to share her new household with. Cora had 2 grown sons from her first marriage who very quickly made it known that they intended to take over the freighting business their stepfather had built, and an unmarried niece by marriage with no blood claim to any of it was, in Cora's calculation, simply an inconvenience to be removed. She worked on Ezra patiently, the way water works on stone, reminding him at every turn that Naomi was nearly past marrying age, that she took up a room the household needed, that a man ought to think of his new wife's comfort before an orphan niece who was, after all, no true kin at all. Ezra, who had never in his life stood up to a determined woman and was not about to start at 61, said nothing when Cora's sons began sleeping in the loft that had been Naomi's since childhood, said nothing when her chores were quietly reassigned to Cora's own daughter-in-law, and finally, on a cold morning with Russ still silvering the yard, said the words that Naomi would remember for the rest of her life, that it might be best, now, for everyone, if she found her own situation. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with a settled decision only prolonged the humiliation of it, and so she packed the little that was truly hers, her mother's Bible, a good wool coat, a set of her father's carpentry tools she had kept oiled and sharp for 20 years, though she rarely had occasion to use them, and the $11 she had managed to save from small freighting jobs Ezra had let her handle on the side. And she walked into town with her chin level and her eyes dry, because she would not give Cora Vance the satisfaction of tears witnessed by the whole of Larkspur Hollow. She took a single room above the Mercantile, paid for 1 week in advance, and began, in the practical way her mother had taught her, to take stock of what remained. It was not much. She was 31, unmarried, with no property, no family willing to claim her, and a trade, freighting, that in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow was entirely controlled by the very family that had just cast her out. What she had was her father's tools, her mother's steadiness, and $11 that had to somehow become a living. It was old Otis Pruitt, the station master, who mentioned the railroad car almost as a joke while Naomi sat on the depot bench turning over in her mind whether she might travel to Denver and find work in a boarding house. The spur line behind the depot, laid a decade earlier when a silver strike promised more traffic than ever actually came, had been abandoned along with the mind that inspired it, and one lone passenger car, coupled to nothing, wheels rusted into the earth, had simply been left there when the railroad pulled up the rest of the track for scrap. The company had long since written it off their books as worthless, and Otis said, not unkindly, that the county would probably let anyone haul it away who wanted the scrap iron, or that a person desperate enough for shelter could likely buy it outright from the railroad's regional office for a few dollars, since nobody in Denver cared about one dead car on a dead spur. He said the way a man says something to be polite, not really expecting an answer, and was startled when Naomi's eyes lit with something that looked less like desperation and more like recognition. She had grown up around wood and iron and machinery that other people called ruined. She knew, in a way few in Larkspur Hollow could have known, that abandoned and worthless were not always the same word. She wrote to the railroad's regional office in Denver that same afternoon, and 3 weeks later received a reply, curt and faintly amused in tone, informing her that Union Pacific held no further interest in car number 214, that it had been struck from the company's rolling inventory as scrap, and that she was welcome to purchase whatever remained of it for the sum of $4, payable to the station master, provided she understood the railroad bore no responsibility for its condition. She walked to the depot with the money already counted into an envelope, and when Otis Pruitt took it from her, chuckling, and told the telegraph operator that Naomi Buell had just paid $4 for a rat's nest on wheels, she only smiled and said that she had been raised to believe a thing was worth exactly what work you were willing to put into it, no more and no less, and that she intended to put in quite a lot. The car itself, when she first stepped up into it with a lantern in the gray hour before dawn so no one would witness her disappointment if there was reason for it, was worse than even the gossip suggested. Rain had gotten in through a broken clear-story window and rotted a section of the floor near the stove. Mice had colonized the seat cushions. A family of barn swallows had built and abandoned 3 seasons of nests in the luggage racks. But her father's training rose up in her immediately, unbidden. The old habit of running her palm along with a feel for what could be saved beneath what merely looked ruined, and what she found surprised her. The car's frame, the heavy oak understructure that any passenger car of that era was built upon, was sound, dry-rotted only where water had pooled, solid everywhere else, built by craftsmen in an age when railroad companies had not yet learned to economize on materials. The brass fittings, though tarnished black, were solid brass, not the thin plate that later cars would use. And the long bench seats that ran along both walls, upholstered once in a maroon plush now gray with mildew and age, were built with a hollow storage compartment beneath each cushion, a common enough feature in cars of that vintage meant for stowing linens or small luggage on longer routes. It was in prying open the third of these seats, 2 days into her work of clearing debris and assessing what timber needed replacing, that her crowbar caught not on rusted hinges but on something that had been deliberately wedged and sealed beneath the seat's false bottom, a thin panel of matching oak fitted with a craftsman's precision that no railroad company would have bothered installing at the factory. Someone, at some point in the car's working life, had built a hidden compartment into it, and had done so with care. Beneath that panel she found a metal dispatch box, the kind railroad conductors once used to carry manifests and mail pouches, rusted at the latch but intact, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the worst of the damp away, a bundle of letters, a small leather ledger, and a single daguerreotype of a young man in a conductor's uniform standing beside this very car, its number 214, visible on the frame behind him, his arm around a woman Naomi did not recognize, both of them smiling, in the particular unguarded way of people who do not yet know what is coming for them. The ledger, when she carried it back to her rented room and read it by lamplight long into the night, unraveled a story that Larkspur Hollow had spent 11 years trying very hard to forget. The conductor in the photograph was a man named Thomas Aldridge, who had worked the Larkspur Spur during the brief silver boom, and the woman beside him was his wife, Marguerite, who had taught school in the very building where the Mercantile now stood. The ledger was not a railroad document at all, but Thomas's private accounting, kept in a neat, careful hand, of wages he had quietly diverted over 3 years of work. Not stolen, the entries made painfully clear, but earned through extra shifts and mail contracts he had never reported to the company. Money he was saving in secret to buy out his family's share of a played-out claim that his late father had left encumbered by debt to a man named Silas Warwick, who at that time ran the assay office and, as it happened, held a mortgage on nearly every small claim and business in Larkspur Hollow. The letters, written between Thomas and Marguerite and a lawyer in Denver, revealed the rest. Thomas had accumulated enough by the ledger's final entries in 1876 to satisfy the debt entirely and clear his family's claim, a modest but genuine vein over that Warwick had been quietly working under the terms of the mortgage while paying the Aldridge family almost nothing. But before Thomas could complete the transaction, he had been killed. The ledger did not say how, but a newspaper clipping tucked among the letters, brittle and yellowed, reported the derailment of a freight car on the very spur line where car 214 had run, a wreck that claimed the life of a conductor and was attributed, officially, to a rock slide. Naomi sat with that clipping for a long while, feeling the particular chill of understanding that history is rarely as tidy as an official report. Something about the timing, a man on the verge of exposing or ending a predatory debt, dying in a convenient accident on the very line he worked, sat wrong in her stomach the way rotted would sat wrong under her palm, invisible until you knew to look for it. She had grown up in Larkspur Hollow long enough to know the name Silas Warwick, though the man himself had died some years back. What she had not known, what almost no one in town seemed to know or perhaps chose not to remember, was that his son, Garrett Warwick, had inherited both his father's estate business and, apparently, his father's mortgages, and now ran the very bank that held notes on half the struggling homesteads in the valley, including, as Naomi would soon learn with a cold jolt of recognition, a note on Ezra Buell's freighting business that Cora Vance's sons had been quietly renegotiating in ways that would ultimately squeeze Ezra out of the operation he had spent his whole life building. The deeper Naomi read, the clearer the shape of the old injustice became. Marguerite Aldridge, widowed and grieving, had apparently tried in the months after her husband's death to claim the family mine using the funds Thomas had saved, only to find that the ledger and the money themselves had vanished, presumably still hidden somewhere in the car where Thomas had kept them secret even from his own wife, perhaps out of habit, perhaps meaning to surprise her once the debt was cleared. Without proof of payment or the funds themselves, Marguerite had no way to contest Warwick's continued claim on the mortgage, and within a year she had left Larkspur Hollow for good, her fate afterward unknown to anyone Naomi could find. The mine, meanwhile, had continued to be worked under Warwick family control for another decade, its modest but steady off feeding directly into the fortune that now let Garrett Warwick sit as the most powerful man in the valley, deciding by pen stroke which families kept their land and which did not. Naomi understood, turning the ledger over in her hands as a lamp burned low, that she was holding something far larger than an old sorrow. She was holding proof, date, amount, correspondence with a Denver lawyer, all of it, that the mine Garrett Warwick had spent 11 years operating under a mortgage claim had, in fact, been paid off in full before Thomas Aldrich's death, which meant the mortgage should have been satisfied and the claim returned to the Aldrich family, which meant every dollar over the Warwicks had pulled from that ground since 1876 rightfully belonged to whatever family Thomas Aldrich had left behind. She did not act rashly. She had been raised by a man who taught her to check a wagon axle 3 times before trusting it on a mounting grade, and she applied the same patience here, spending the better part of 2 weeks quietly asking after the Aldrich name of the county recorder's office in the next town over, where a clerk with a long memory for old scandal remembered that Marguerite Aldrich had eventually remarried in Trinidad and had a daughter, and that the daughter, now a grown woman named Louisa Ferris, still lived there running a small dressmaking shop. Naomi wrote to her carefully, enclosing nothing but a brief, respectful letter asking whether the name Thomas Aldrich meant anything to her family, and waited, continuing all the while to repair the railroad car by day, replacing the rotted floor sections with timber she salvaged and milled herself, restringing the brass fittings until they gleamed, because whatever else came of the ledger, she still needed somewhere to live, and she found, to her quiet surprise, that she had begun to love the car, its solid bones, its stubborn refusal to be truly ruined by years of neglect. Word travels quickly in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow, and it was not long before Garrett Warwick himself learned that the Buell woman living in the old railroad car had been asking pointed questions in the county recorder's office about a decade-old mortgage. He came to see her himself on a windy afternoon in late November, dressed in the fine dark wool that marked him as a man who had never once had to work with his hands, and he was, at first, almost gentle, suggesting that whatever old papers she'd found in that car was surely meaningless scraps, that a woman in her position, and he said her position, with a particular emphasis that made clear he knew exactly how thoroughly Ezra Buell's family had cast her aside, would do far better to sell him the car's contents outright for a modest sum, and be done with it, rather than stirring up matters better left buried with the dead. Naomi thanked him for his concern and told him, with the same level composure she had shown on the morning her uncle turned her out, that she had not yet decided what the papers meant or what she intended to do with them, but that she would certainly let him know. The gentleness did not last. Within days, the mercantile owner who rented her the room above his store informed her, with obvious discomfort, that he could no longer extend her credit for supplies, a courtesy every resident of the town enjoyed as a matter of course, and Naomi understood without being told that Warwick's bank held a mercantile's note as well. Freighting contracts she had begun quietly picking up to support herself, hauling small loads for homesteaders too far out to be worth Ezra Buell's larger wagons, began mysteriously falling through, families apologizing that they'd found other arrangements. Even Ezra himself, visited by his new stepson with a suggestion he did not have the strength to refuse, sent word through a neighbor that Naomi ought to leave well enough alone before she brought trouble down on a family that had already taken her in once out of charity. It was, Naomi realized, watching the town's fear of Warwick's economic power calcify around her like ice on a window pane, exactly the same machinery that had crushed Thomas and Marguerite Aldrich 11 years before, still turning, still hungry, and she understood that if she wanted justice for a dead conductor and his forgotten daughter, she would need more than an old ledger. She would need proof no court could dismiss, and she would need it before Warwick found a way to have the railroad car itself condemned and hauled away as a public nuisance, a threat he made, thinly veiled, at a town meeting called ostensibly to discuss spring road repairs. Naomi spent a bitter, determined winter answering that threat the only way she knew how, with the patient, exacting labor her father had taught her. She wrote again to the Denver lawyer whose name appeared throughout Thomas's letters, a Mr. Alonzo Fenimore, and found, in a stroke of fortune she had scarcely dared hope for, that the elderly attorney was not only still living but still possessed his own file copies of the original mortgage documents and correspondence, kept for decades out of a lawyer's habitual thoroughness. Those documents, cross-referenced against the dates and amounts in Thomas's private ledger, proved beyond any reasonable dispute that the mortgage on the Aldrich claim had been satisfied in full 3 weeks before Thomas's death, that Warwick's father had simply never filed a release, and had instead continued operating the mine as though the debt still stood, collecting a decade over that belonged, by every principle of law and decency, to Marguerite Aldrich and, through her, to her daughter Louisa. Naomi traveled to Trinidad herself that February, the railroad car's repairs paused, to meet Louisa Ferris in person, to place in her hands her true father's photograph and the ledger he had kept in secret hope of a future he never lived to see, and to watch a woman who had grown up believing her father left her nothing understand. For the first time, that he had in fact left her everything, sealed away and waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Together, with Fenimore's legal guidance, they brought the matter before a district judge in the spring of 1888, and the case, built on documents so precise and so damning that Warwick's own lawyer reportedly advised him against contesting it publicly, resulted in a quiet but total reckoning. Garrett Warwick was ordered to surrender the mine's operating rights back to Louisa Ferris as Thomas Aldridge's rightful heir, along with a substantial accounting of back profits that the family's original arrangement with the bank had never legally been entitled to collect, and though the settlement he ultimately paid was smaller than the true decade of stolen or might have justified, it was enough to give Louisa Ferris an independence she had never known, and enough, crucially, for Naomi to negotiate on her uncle's behalf, using her new standing and Louisa's grateful support, a full and permanent release of the crushing note Warwick's bank held over Ezra Buell's freighting business, a debt Cora Vance's sons had been quietly maneuvering to inherit at Ezra's expense. Ezra Buell, humbled in age and finally seeing plainly what his silence had nearly cost, came to the railroad car himself that spring, hat in hand, and told his niece, haltingly, that he was sorry, and that whatever she chose to do now, the freighting business would always have a place for her if she wanted it. Naomi, who had learned patience from Wood and dignity from her mother and precision from her father, told him gently that she forgave him, because holding on to that particular grievance would only rot her the way water rots a floor left unattended, but that she had built something of her own now and intended to keep building it. That railroad car, the one the whole town had called a coffin on wheels, the one Otis Pruitt had joked about for the price of $4, became, by the following autumn, the first structure of what Larkspur Hollow would come to know as the Aldridge Way Station, a small but genuinely useful freight depot and traveler's rest that Naomi built outward from Car 214's restored oak frame, using her father's tools in her own two hands, employing at various times half a dozen townsfolk who needed honest work, and naming it, at Louisa Ferris's own insistence, for the conductor whose quiet, hopeful ledger had made it all possible. And so we return to where we began, to a woman standing in a rail yard with a flour sack and $11, to the $4 she paid for what everyone told her was worthless, to the seat beneath which a dead man's careful hope had waited 11 years for someone willing to look closely at a thing others had already written off. Naomi Buell never forgot what it felt like to be told she was not wanted, but she came, in time, to understand that the feeling had taught her something no comfortable life ever could have. That value is rarely where the crowd expects to find it, that patience is its own kind of courage, and that restoring what has been buried, whether a name, a debt, or a family's rightful due, is never wasted labor, even when the world laughs at you for trying. The car that shamed her in October became, by the following spring, the thing the whole valley pointed to with quiet pride, and Naomi, who had wanted nothing but a Bible and a set of carpentry tools, found that she had, without ever intending to, become exactly the kind of person her parents had raised her to be. Thank you for spending this time with Naomi and with us tonight. If her story moved you, we would be so glad if you shared it with someone who might need to hear that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless. We'd love to know, is there a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that others had already dismissed? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read everyone, and we love hearing which parts of these stories stay with you longest. Until next time, stay close.